1. The Whispering Woods. In a small, isolated town, there was a stretch of dense forest known as the Whispering Woods. The locals claimed that if you entered the woods after dark, you'd hear voices, soft, almost indistinguishable whispers that would call your name. One night, a young woman named Alice dared to explore the woods, hoping to debunk the myth. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured deep into the forest. As she walked, the trees closed in around her, and the night grew darker. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. At first she thought it was the wind, but then she heard her name, Alice. Come closer. Her heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, surrounding her from all directions. Panicking, she turned to run, but found that she couldn't move. The trees seemed to close in on her, their branches reaching out like hands. The last thing Alice heard before everything went black was the sound of her own voice joining the whispers. "Help me." The next morning, the townspeople found her flashlight at the edge of the woods, but Alice was never seen again. The whispers in the woods, however, grew louder after that night, and the townspeople swear they now hear two voices calling for help. 2. The mirror's reflection. Emily had always loved antique shopping, especially for unique pieces to decorate her home. One day, she came across an old, ornate mirror in a dusty corner of a thrift store. It was beautiful, with intricate carvings on the frame, and the glass was surprisingly clear despite its age. She bought it on the spot and hung it in her bedroom. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the mirror didn't seem quite right. It was subtle at first, a slight delay in movement, a shadow in the background that didn't exist in the room. Over the next few days, the discrepancies became more obvious. Her reflection would smile when she wasn't, or move when she was still. One evening, Emily decided to confront the mirror. She stood in front of it, staring into her reflection's eyes. Suddenly, her reflection's smile widened into a sinister grin, and it reached out toward her. But instead of touching the glass, its hand passed through, grabbing Emily's wrist. Frozen with fear, Emily couldn't move as her reflection began to pull her into the mirror. She struggled, but the grip was too strong. With a final, desperate scream, she was dragged through the glass. The next morning, Emily's mirror was found shattered on the floor, but she was nowhere to be found. In the shards of broken glass, if you look closely, you might still see her terrified face, forever trapped on the other side. 3. The Haunting of Room 213. A young couple, Sarah and Michael, decided to take a weekend getaway at a quaint old hotel in the mountains. The hotel had a charming historic feel, but the receptionist seemed oddly hesitant as she handed them the key to room 213. That night, they settled in, but Sarah couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The room felt colder than the rest of the hotel, and there was a strange odor in the air. As they got ready for bed, they noticed odd noises, scratches on the walls, faint whispers, and the feeling of being watched. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke up to find Michael sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you see her?" he replied, pointing to the corner of the room. Sarah turned to look, but the corner was empty. Michael's eyes were wide with fear. "She's been watching us since we got here." Terrified, Sarah grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the corner. There, for a brief moment, she saw the figure of a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. As the light hit her, she vanished, leaving only the echo of a whisper in the room. The couple fled the hotel that night, leaving their belongings behind. The next morning, the hotel staff found room 213 empty, the bed neatly made, but the mirror shattered and the walls scratched with deep, jagged marks. They later learned that the room had been sealed off years ago after a tragic event involving a woman who never checked out. 4. The Forgotten Doll. When Lucy's grandmother passed away, she inherited an old, dusty box from the attic. Inside was a porcelain doll dressed in a faded blue gown with cold, glassy eyes that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Lucy's grandmother had never mentioned the doll before, but something about it made Lucy uneasy. Despite her discomfort, Lucy placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, thinking it was just an old toy. That night, she woke to the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps in her room. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, straining to hear. The room was dark, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the curtains. She looked toward the shelf, but the doll was gone. Panic set in as she scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then she saw it, the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its head tilted to one side, its eyes locked onto hers. Lucy screamed, but the doll began to move, its tiny hands reaching out for her. She bolted from the bed, running to the door, but it wouldn't open. The footsteps were right behind her now. Just as she felt the cold touch of porcelain on her ankle, she managed to fling the door open and escape. The next morning, Lucy returned to her room with her parents, but the doll was back on the shelf, its eyes staring blankly ahead. No one believed her story, chalking it up to a nightmare. But every night after that, Lucy heard the footsteps growing closer each time. Eventually, the doll was sealed away in the attic once more, but Lucy could never forget the sound of those tiny, shuffling steps. 5. The shadow in the basement. The old house at the end of Maple Street had a reputation. It was said that the original owner, a reclusive man named Mr. Graves, had died under mysterious circumstances in the basement. Over the years, the house remained vacant, as potential buyers were scared off by strange occurrences. One day, a young family moved in. Dismissing the stories as mere superstition, they noticed the odd creaks and groans of the old house, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until their son, Timmy, began talking about the shadow man in the basement. At first, they thought it was just his imagination, but then strange things started happening. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and they would hear faint whispers coming from the basement, even when no one was down there. One evening, the parents decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, they descended the creaky stairs into the cold, damp basement. The air grew thick with unease as they scanned the room. Suddenly the flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment they saw it. A tall, dark figure standing in the corner, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. Terrified, they backed away, but the shadow began to move toward them, its form growing more defined with each step. The parents bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind them. That night, they packed up and left the house for good. The next morning, the house was found abandoned, with the basement door ajar and a single message scrawled on the wall in the dust. He never left. The house remains empty to this day, but those who pass by at night claim to see a shadowy figure standing at the basement window, watching and waiting.